Thank you everyone for joining us today for the Hague Book Seminar. I'm really pleased to have Professor Benjamin Farrand, who's professor in Law and Emerging Technologies and Regulation and Governance at Newcastle University at the Center of Excellence in Cybersecurity. And I'm really excited to have him here today to speak about a very topical issue. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to him, where he will give a presentation on his new book, The Geopolitical Union, and then we will turn it over to Q&A after about 30 minutes. But Professor Farrand has mentioned that he's really pleased to have an interactive engagement throughout the talk. So I'll also leave it to Ben to facilitate that, the start. Thanks.
Excellent. So thank you very much, everybody. And thank you so much both to the audience for being here, Julia, for organizing this on behalf of the Hague Institute. It's an absolute pleasure to speak to everybody today. So as mentioned, I'm more than happy for this to be totally interactive. If there are things that I say that people want to question at the time or things they'd like a bit more information on, I'm more than happy for people to sort of let me know. I think probably the easiest way to do it because of the screen sharing is if you use the raise hand function. I think it brings you to the top of the list of people, so I'll be able to sort of answer questions then as we go along. So this presentation is really more than anything else. I don't want to call it an advertisement for the book. You know, it's there is an element here that is talking about essentially the rationale behind the book more than the book itself in some respects. What are the reasons I decided to write it? What are the things that I think are happening? And in particular, I want this to be a bit more forward-facing. The book was sent to the publishers about a year ago, more or less. And, you know, there are a few fields, I think, where you can say that things have changed quite as much as quickly as both European Union politics generally, as well as digital technology policies specifically. So there's a sort of forward element in this work as well, saying, okay, where do things go from here? And how do the frameworks that are established in the book help us to sort of put those into a particular context or bring a perspective to it? So can I just double check whether you can all see the next slide or?
Yes.
Perfect.
Thanks.
Excellent. Okay. So I thought it might be useful to provide a quick overview of the talk itself, just to sort of provide a bit of context so people know what is coming. So first, I'm going to talk about the ideas behind the book project, where the sort of main motivations came from. I'm going to talk about the development of the theoretical framework specifically, because as well as trying to contribute to the sort of understandings of digital sovereignty and strategic autonomy that are increasingly characterizing policymaking in this area, I wanted to provide a sort of framework for understanding the actions that you take in order to achieve that goal. So if we consider digital sovereignty to either be a sort of goal or rationale behind action, how exactly is it you operationalize that? And so regulatory mechanism is my way of trying to understand how you go from sort of conditions to rationales to policy action. I look at this in particular in the context of the von der Leyen Commission 1 specifically, so the work being done between 2019 to 2024. But I am going to then start talking about things that happened during von der Leyen 2 and how this then, you can see sort of like a framework that's been built and now it's being rapidly expanded on across a range of different areas. As well, if anybody's interested, I can spend some time talking about how you might be able to use this sort of framework in your own work, as well as potentially, you know, other areas it could apply to. So I apply it very much in the context of tech policy, but I can see some clear parallels where it could be relevant for thinking about things like energy policy, financial regulation, all sorts of different areas where we're now seeing this sort of intersectionality between economy and security as fields of action. So the book itself is called Geopolitical Union, Europe's Attempt to Take Back Control of Technology Regulation, which is a title that's ever so slightly tongue-in-cheek because discussions of sovereignty and taking back control tend to be synonymous. And anybody familiar with the Brexit referendum and the discussions there was always this talk about sovereignty in the context of taking back control. And so this is both a reflection of what Europe's trying to do, but also maybe poking a little bit of fun at the European Commission by sort of adopting the rhetoric that was very, very effective in the context of the Brexit referendum. So where did the project come from? A lot of the work I've done historically, particularly in cybersecurity, and given the sort of the focus of the Hague Institute, I'm using cybersecurity as the main case study in today's talk, has really been focused on privatization. And so a lot of work with my sort of frequent co-author and sort of constant wife as Helena Carapico has been around privatization and public-private relations in security a bit more broadly. We're very, very interested in the role of the private sector, not only in lawmaking, but also their ability to sort of shape regulation. So their role as regulation shapers as well as sort of adopters. A lot of our work was focused on the idea of regulatory capitalism, the way that the capitalist sort of framework created certain ideas or understandings of public-private relations, the idea of industry and particular sectors as being experts, the idea of these sectors possessing both expertise and capacity to act that maybe the state didn't potentially have, and the sort of underlying rationale of efficiencies. So economic efficiency was often given as a reason in a lot of these fields for why the public sector does it better. So, for example, if we think about cybersecurity, NIS1, the Network Information Systems Directive, the first iteration, was very much based on the idea that the EU sets these sort of like the general standards or the frameworks, but that it's really the private sector with the capacity and the expertise to put this into effect. So in other words, this is the most efficient potential outcome. Now, particularly with the von der Leyen Commission and everything that started happening in the EU, even a little bit earlier, if we think about the Brexit referendum, the invasion of Crimea by Russia in 2015, and the general sort of sense of polycrisis that develops at the end of the 2010s, this framework wasn't really corresponding with what we were observing anymore. So we kept saying, well, you know, we have this public sector, private sector cooperation. There seems to be this sort of element of interaction between the two. But we're seeing less of this active private sector involvement in regulation shaping and much more sort of rhetoric on the part of policymakers that there needed to be a bit more state in all of these decisions. That actually the state was maybe in a position where too much authority, too much power had been given, in particular to big tech. So a lot of the discussions about big tech start in the sort of the late 2010s, because the view is that now big tech isn't necessarily a sort of value neutral actor that can help promote European productiveness and competitiveness. It may have values that don't necessarily correspond with those of the European Union. So we're seeing a complete reshaping of those relations where the regulatory capitalism framework that was devised by people like Levy, Fowler, and Braithwaite isn't really working the way that people think that it ordinarily would within the liberal international economic order. One of the things in particular is you see a sort of changing in European discourse, particularly with von der Leyen's political guidelines, where you don't see that economic efficiency is now the single driver, but there's a lot more in the way of security discourse in that communication. It's about democracy protection. It's about security. It's about security across a whole range of different fields. And while that's intimately connected to the economy, these two things aren't essentially being positioned as trade-offs anymore, with what is good for the economy being bad for security or vice versa, but actually a sort of interlinkage where these two things are seen as mutually interdependent. In some respects, this is also, I don't know whether I'd call it a corrective to the Brussels effect discourse, or at least a challenging of the idea that Europe is able to effectively regulate almost by fiat, by the fact that its market is so big that people just naturally gravitate towards the way that Europe does things. This is saying that Europe is still definitely trying to interact and sort of shape the international system, but this is coming from a place of trying to exert regulatory pressure rather than everybody else just aligning because of how wonderful the single market is. And that sounds a little bit flippant, but I think it's more the idea that, particularly when everybody saw the success of the GDPR, the assumption was that everybody will gravitate towards European rules. What the EU noticed is this gravitation wasn't necessarily happening, and sometimes you need to do a little bit more in the way of push rather than just relying on pull factors in this respect. Now, the other key thing that really, really influenced the book, and particularly the theoretical framework, is teaching. So for any of you that are, frequent sort of teachers that think about the idea that, research-led teaching really means that your research dictates everything that happens in the classroom, it can be useful to think about it the other way around as well, that the teaching can actually start to influence the research. So for a number of years, I've been teaching the international trade law related modules in the law school. And one of the things I became increasingly interested in through this teaching was the idea of these trade cycles. We have periods of opening up where suddenly markets become free, trade becomes globalized, everybody starts interacting on what we could consider a sort of more peaceful basis. And then we have periods of retraction with increased protection, nationalism, economic force, turning in some cases even into physical force, and the idea that you had to essentially protect your own markets while exploiting the markets of others. So a lot of this comes through the idea of what is called mercantilism, or as Adam Smith called it, the mercantile system. And when I was reading about this, I thought there are some really, really interesting parallels here. We think about, the EU operating within a free trade sort of system, the EU being a promoter of free and fair trade, as it often referred to it. And yet some of what was actually happening in terms of discourse to begin with, and then policies and actions afterwards, didn't necessarily correspond with this model. And in some respects started to correspond a little bit more with what would be considered to be mercantilism. Now, it's important to state the EU is not a mercantilist actor, and I'm going to define mercantilism shortly. In some respect, what we can see coming out of the United States at this point in time is probably a much clearer example of what we would call almost pure form mercantilism. Similarly, some of what China has been doing over the past few years could be seen as something similar, whereas the EU, as I'm going to discuss, does not have the ability to do so. Because it doesn't have the ability to engage in these sort of trade actions on this basis, it instead does it through regulation, which is why I've come up with this as concept of regulatory mercantilism. So regulatory mercantilism, more than anything else, is my attempt to really try and provide some sort of conceptual or theoretical grounding for a lot of what is happening at the moment. So I've got here the picture of Valdis Dombrovskis, who gave a very interesting speech on what he called European economic security strategy a number of years ago. Because regulatory mercantilism is really an attempt to rethink economic security governance in 21st century Europe. So how do we get there? We start by thinking about mercantilism specifically. So with mercantilism, it's important to think first, what are the conditions under which it arises? So mercantilism really sort of starts to appear in the 16th, 17th centuries in Europe that are being marked by a whole range of different conflicts. We have conflicts over religion. We have conflicts over scarcity of certain resources. We have conflicts between the Netherlands and what is then England over access to fish. We have conflict between the Netherlands and other states in Europe around the control of certain resources in parts of Southern Europe. You've entered into a situation where there are a lot of conflicts that are essentially over the idea of, firstly, what is the role of the state? How does the state exert external influence? And how does it guarantee its own internal security? So it's not just about the relations with other states, it's also about how the state does things within its own territory. And its underlying rationale, more than anything else, was the idea essentially of state making through market building. And so you can see some sort of parallels with the EU as an institution a bit more generally in that respect. But here it was very much a case of something explicit. The fact that in order to have a strong state, you needed to be economically successful. You needed to be prosperous. In the absence of prosperity, you cannot guarantee security. And this was for various reasons. If we're talking about 15th, or rather 16th, 17th century politics, it's because without money, you can't build an army. Without money, you can't build the ships that you need in the context of naval conflict. If you don't have ships, you can't then expand your sort of reach throughout the rest of the world. And so there is a sort of implicit element here, and it's mentioned briefly in the book, but it's not the main focus, that a core aspect of this was colonial extractivism. And so this is something you need to bear in mind that this was not just a case of states protecting their own borders. It was essentially de facto expanding their borders internationally. And so you have points of time where different nations, including England, declare themselves to have sovereignty over the seas. And the way that you have this sovereignty is through the economic prosperity that allows you to generate the power needed to provide control over those areas. So we rule the waves, in other words, because we have the power and the money to be able to do so. So the story of mercantilism in some respects is also a story of empire building. And again, I'm not trying to say that the EU is trying to build an empire, but you have sort of analogies in the sort of the construction of states in this respect. So how is it operationalized or given effect? Because it's great to talk about sovereignty. It's great to talk about, the need to give protection when you feel vulnerable, but how do you actually do that? In the context of the EU, some of the things that the EU, I'm jumping ahead a little bit. In the context of traditional mercantilism, it's the use of law and power to promote industrial policy internally. And if you look at what the states what they do at that point, where you can argue that they should sort of show, elements of mercantilism, they're using law to reduce barriers internally. So you see it in Germany with the removal of the ability of individual, towns to create their own tariffs and customs and entry sort of barriers for getting into their markets. You see it in terms of the creation of common road systems and common currencies as a way of trying to generate state trade. In the context of Colbert's reforms in France, it's about specific, incentives created through law to develop particular industries, all with the idea that these things make that state stronger. And by making them stronger, you make them more secure. It's about control over natural resources. Who has them, who gets to use them, taking the resources of others while making sure that yours don't leave. Because what you see is that you increasingly have laws that seek to restrict value-added imports. In other words, stop goods that are expensive coming into your own market while promoting actively their export, trying to generate income by selling the value added by controlling the natural resource. And as a result, you have the interlinking of economic and security goals and external force projection. In this case, we're talking about explicit use of force. So the way that this is referred to in the literature of the time with the economic thinkers of the 16th and 17th centuries, they talk about power and plenty. The fact that power, also related to security, and plenty, related to economic policy, were interlinked. Without power, there is no plenty. Without plenty, you cannot have power. And so you see this sort of intersection and interaction between the two. Now, regulatory mercantilism bears similarities. The conditions under which it arises are, again, conditions of geopolitical instability and senses of vulnerability. Its underlying rationale, again, is one of sovereignty, seeking to create and facilitate a sort of state or state-like structure in order to give both economic prosperity and security. And what we see is those two ideas become inherently linked. It's operationalized or given effect through the use of law to promote industrial policy internally. And I'm going to give some examples of this when I start looking at specific case studies. We see the desire for increased control in the context of the EU, increased oversight. And so a move from systems of light touch and self-regulations to systems of co-regulation. Control over both natural and digital resources, ranging from raw materials to data as an almost form of digital natural resource, with, again, attempts to limit regulatory import, whether it is in the case of other states determining standards or private sector operators creating essentially their own regulatory regimes by the strength of their market power, while promoting regulatory export, the idea of trying to promote European standards as global standards. And here we see an interlinking of economic and security goals and external regulatory force projection, which the EU starts referring to as the Geopolitical Union. The ability of the Europe to stand as one internally, while ensuring that its own standards, rules, and values become de facto world standards externally. So this idea of regulatory mercantilism being limit what comes in terms of regulation and control, but maximize what you can export in terms of the controls over the things that are outside of your territory. So again, if you're looking at this a little bit more cynically, or you work more in the sort of this field, it may be interesting to think of this in terms of forms of neo-colonialism, for example. The EU trying to exert its own regulatory standards as world standards as a way of essentially trying to exert its reach on other states. So what are the conditions? Everything is fine. The alternative image I was going to use here was the dog in the room that is on fire. We've seen a lot of writing, particularly since 2018, 2019, about the end of the liberal international order. You had the first Trump presidency. You had the feeling that was chaotic, that it was marked by protectionism, increased nationalism, each state for itself. And those terms and feelings have not really got much better, as we're going to see. But the conditions in which the EU starts talking about digital and technological sovereignty are the conditions in which it sees itself being caught between multiple different sources of conflict. You have the global financial crisis. The global financial crisis is bad for the United States. By extension, it becomes bad for the European Union through the Eurozone crisis. And this Eurozone crisis and the responses to it generate a legitimacy crisis. You have discussions about populism and the way that, populist actors are providing, simple solutions for difficult problems. And in particular, with the 2015 European Parliament elections, a feeling that the sort of two extremes of European politics are becoming stronger while the center is failing to hold. And so the EU is thinking, how on earth do we respond to a lot of these challenges? So that is where the von der Leyen Commission comes in. But then, if anything, the situation just compounds. It gets worse and worse and worse. In 2020, you have the COVID crisis. In 2022, you have the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. You have the semiconductor shock. You have the sort of the feeling that even though you have a Biden administration, which in principle is more committed to the international order and the idea of a rules-based system, is doing a lot of things that the EU think are nothing more than market protectionism. And so there tends to be a little bit of conflict behind the scenes, not as overt as it is now, about what direction the international system is going in. And what we find is that the Biden administration, for example, doesn't roll back on some of Trump's policies. He actually takes them further. And so the European Union starts to get this feeling at that point that maybe the UK, or rather the United States, is not the reliable ally in international politics it's always assumed it is. So we end up with a position then, and I've tried to find a picture of von der Leyen looking as nervous as I possibly could for this one, that the EU is caught between the United States and China in the context of digital technology specifically. So Farrell and Newman wrote a brilliant article and then book about what it called weaponized interdependence, the ability that people becoming reliant on certain in their case, they were talking about the financial transaction system, but the fact that there are certain things that can actually be, weaponized in the context of international trade. Sorry, I think I might have seen a hand go up. Was it Dimitri, maybe? Did you have a question?
No, it was me. I just lost my internet connection and reconnected. Sorry.
No worries. That's all good. It's okay. So we're in a position where the EU feels like it is caught between China's increased power in digital markets. It is concerned by the fact that China seems to be wielding increased influence over bodies like the UN's Internet Governance Forum, its role in European standard setting, and it's concerned by the power of the private sector in the United States. And so again, the talk is always about big tech, how big tech is shaping markets, sometimes distorting markets. You have social media platforms that are misusing data and creating crises of legitimacy for the European Union through the use of disinformation on their systems. There are concerns over data. Where is data going? Who has access to it and on what conditions? The US Cloud Act, for example, being one major concern for the EU, but also what happens with services like TikTok and what happens with the data they're collecting, not only on European citizens, but European policymakers. So the solution for the EU is digital sovereignty, strategic autonomy, and Europe's right to choose. So strategic autonomy is essentially the idea of reducing external dependencies because external dependency is equivalent to vulnerability. And so digital sovereignty or technological sovereignty, both terms being used, become inherently linked to this idea. The digital sovereignty is dependent upon strategic autonomy, and strategic autonomy is dependent upon achieving this sovereignty. Now, the way that I try to add to this debate by saying, and the way you do this is through these measures that can be classified as regulatory mercantilism in form. Now, a lot of this is sort of coming from the Shaping Europe's Digital Future initiative. So it has a particular line in it that says digital sovereignty starts from ensuring the integrity and resilience of our data infrastructure, networks, and communications. It requires creating the right conditions for Europe to develop and deploy its own key capacities, thereby reducing our dependency on other parts of the globe for the most crucial technologies. Europe's ability to define its own rules and values in the digital age will be reinforced by such capacities. So here we see the interlinking of economic and security goals. Europe's ability to choose is determined by both the integrity and resilience of its infrastructure, which in turn is dependent on its ability to develop and deploy its own key capacities. The ability to exert economic growth is inherently linked to the ability to create security, but that security can only come if we have the control over those industries and sectors in the first place. So this then links into the idea of control over resources, control over digital technologies. And if that can't be physical or geographical control, how do we ensure that technologies used in Europe are governed by European standards? A lot of this relates, as we're going to see, and is being sort of magnified now around digital industrial policy, creating the market conditions through incentives, through direct funding, through creating conditions for Europe to generate its own industries rather than being reliant on those technologies being produced overseas. And again, limit regulatory import, stop, to put it bluntly, stop foreign standards, shaping Europe's standards, stop foreign tech from becoming the de facto technologies of Europe. Where that's not possible, increase regulatory oversight. So you can actually have some control over how those technologies are used, even if not how they are designed. So what you have is regulating for a digital Europe, putting digital sovereignty into action through regulatory mercantilism. Now, again, because this is cybersecurity as a focus, this is what I'm going to talk about a little bit more, but I can give some quick examples of some of the other areas. So you start with the cybersecurity strategy for the digital decade in 2020 that explicitly frames this in terms of Europe's resilience, technological sovereignty, and that should be leadership. And I don't know why that became resilience twice. So resilience, sovereignty, leadership. There are concerns over the influence over other states and private sector actors over standards, an increased concern regarding hybrid threats, and in particular, the EU talks in the context of cyber about the interlinking of cybersecurity threats, cyber attacks, with disinformation campaigns. And they say that we see certain actors, Russia in particular, using this combination, attacking our infrastructure, attacking our information systems, while also spreading disinformation, both about the EU, but also about the nature of these cyber attacks. Within the cybersecurity strategy, it talks about the need for increased oversight internally and exerting regulatory influence externally, which they frame as leadership. So saying that we need leadership in the international system to ensure that the rules and values by which cybersecurity are determined are those that are aligned with our own values and principles. So what do they do legally? Legally, you build and protect internally while exerting regulatory influence externally. So you've got Regulation 2022, amending Regulation 1025/2012 as regards decisions of European standardization organizations concerning European standards and European standardization deliverables. And I've put in brackets here, the names become snappier later, because there's a certain discursive dimension to this as well, that the EU starts trying to frame things interestingly in terms of acts. And I've got an idea from an article I've never got around to writing, but something about the power of the acts of American law. So, we talk about things like the Patriot Act, the Chips and Science Act here. They become these big sort of like focal points for regulatory work. And I think there's an element here where the EU has said that the fact that all our regulation titles are very, very wordy, they are long, it's sort of, in some respects, almost hiding the big efforts we're making in these fields. They sound like technical documents rather than things that govern the future of Europe. So let's start taking on some of those names. And we see this start to develop. We have the Digital Services Act. And as we see on this screen, the Cyber Resilience Act, the Cyber Solidarity Act, taking these big concepts like resilience, security, solidarity, and turning them into acts on their own merits. So they're often in the form of regulation from a technical perspective, but in terms of their discursive force, they are acts. They are acts of Europe trying to do something in a particular field. And in the context of the regulation on cybersecurity requirements, it's about exerting regulatory influence over what is happening with technologies produced outside of Europe, to say that if they are used in Europe, they are then governed by European standards, standards of security, standards of sort of not just security of the product, but security of the entire supply chain. How are you guaranteeing the integrity of this product all the way through the digital supply chain? The Cyber Solidarity Act about creating a common European response, the European Cyber Shield, incentivizing by creating an industrial policy for cybersecurity products that is then used to guarantee Europe's security. And during questions, I can come back to any of these pieces in a bit more detail. Supply chains, there are concerns over external shocks, a need for internal reforms, where it extends cybersecurity beyond the immediate cyber attack through to the building blocks of that cybersecurity. And we see here semiconductors and semiconductor shock as a key motivator for action, with a desire on the part of the EU to have a combination of heavily globalized supply chains under their control, with a desire to try and bring some of that production within Europe geographically. And what we see here is that the increased conflict between the US and China over semiconductors and chip manufacture, with the EU caught in the middle, becomes a big incentivizing action for the European Union. If semiconductors can be weaponized in the context of an US-China trade war, what does Europe do to protect itself? And what it does is say we need an industrial policy internally, the European Chips Act, with control over the critical raw materials externally, the Critical Raw Materials Act, to say that if we cannot guarantee the control over these natural products because these raw materials don't exist in Europe, we need to be able to exert regulatory influence over the entire supply chain. If we can bring something into Europe, such as the actual fabrication of these chips, we should do so. And one of the key aspects of the European Chips Act was the creation of a tech industrial policy for creating fabrication plants. Leverage external relationships through things like the Global Gateway, the use of internal organizations, as ways of trying to essentially promote and export European regulation and standards, while protecting your own markets by creating industrial policies internally. We see it similarly in the field of data and social media governance. The concerns over where data goes, meaning try and store that data in Europe as possible. So use the Data Governance Act and Data Act to create European data spaces. Use it to try and facilitate the creation of European cloud products as competitors to Amazon WS, so AWS on the part of Amazon, or some of the servers produced by China like Tencent. There's a very interesting statement here by Thierry Breton, who was then Internal Market Commissioner, that Europe may have lost the battle to create digital champions capable of taking on US and Chinese companies harvesting personal data, but it can win the war on industrial data. Almost a suggestion there that maybe the focus on European personal data in terms of protection of values missed the value of personal data as a product. And so we need to do this with industrial data in a way that we didn't do it with personal data, which in some respects kind of sees this sort of shift in focus of what the European Union wants to do in some respects. And I could come back to this in questions if that's something anybody wants to go into in more detail. And one of the last arguments really is about the Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act, saying that where we can exert that explicit regulatory control, that's what we're going to do. We don't have a European Facebook. Maybe we don't even want a European Facebook, but we don't have one. So let's try and control explicitly what they do to ensure that if they're offering a service in Europe, it's on our terms. This was explicitly framed in terms of reining in foreign tech, taking back control of regulation in Europe. So we often see in terms of the discourse, when it comes to the social media platforms who became, a sort of, easily used punching bag in some respects, we're going to use the most sort of overt discourse here. These are platforms that do not take seriously our rules and values, so we are going to make them. And some of Thierry Breton's statements, particularly on Twitter, talking about Twitter, were considered to be, even by some European Commission officials, pretty inflammatory in this space. So, elephant in the room, what about AI? We have the big AI Act, but where does that fit? I would argue, in some respects, not as a good example of regulatory mercantilism, because it wasn't really designed with that in mind. It's coming from how do we ensure that this is safe for European consumers and European citizens. But what I would say is the building blocks to make AI models happen are based on data. And so you see an inherent linkage here between the data governance and data security positions of the EU, and then how exactly it is going to implement AI in Europe. So AI and the AI Act is about the safety of the underlying models in their usage, but not around an industrial policy for AI. But the reason is this actually comes later. So the future of the geopolitical union, and the picture I've picked is of two people not from Europe, because essentially, again, we're seeing that what is happening here and what is motivating here is not internal, but external. The world is feeling even more insecure for Europe at this point in time. And one of the key examples is that Trump, too, has shown that not only is it not a friend to Europe, it's quite possibly an adversary or an enemy in some respects. And Greenland in particular, which isn't mentioned in the book because that happens afterwards, is really one of those sort of like flashpoints of the European Union, where it says, hang on, not only is this a state that we can't necessarily predict, it's a state that doesn't necessarily have our interests, not only our best interests in mind, but really cares about those interests at all. And furthermore, if it's something from us that it wants, it will take. And we see that again with the negotiation of quite a one-sided trade agreement with the United States over tariffs that the US government just says we're not going to implement. So we've got your agreement, but we're not going to follow it. So digital sovereignty specifically, we see that it's becoming something that is sort of being hard-coded into the way the EU works rather than just ancillary, with the creation of a commissioner for tech, sovereignty, security, and democracy. So again, linking all those different issues. A reinforced discourse of geopolitical union during times of conflict, with new battles coming. Electric vehicles and concern over Chinese manufacturers being a flashpoint in 2024, but showing how quickly this is moving. Nobody in Europe is really talking about Chinese electrical vehicles at this point. The conversation has moved on because essentially it's been superseded by other events. The Trump administration rolling back liberal internationalism further, as well as regulation, but all the different flashpoints, with the Iran conflict just being the latest example of where European and US interests and European values and American values seem to be diverging quite substantially. In terms of initiatives, we see a real reinforcing this idea that economic security and security economy, I mean, I don't know how to sort of like frame it, but the two are not only mutually sort of compatible, they're actually absolutely codependent. It's not just about being interlinked, it's that one secures the other secures the other. Well, I mean, I've used the word security so many times, it's lost all meaning. The competitive compass is very much framed around the idea of economy and security being mutually reinforcing goals, not only for tech policy and sovereignty at this point, but European sovereignty full stop. We see a raft of different sort of legislative and sort of like white paper style publications. Rearm Europe. Rearm Europe is all about the need for economic development in Europe to guarantee its security externally. And that's in the context of defense. The Protect EU strategy is framed in terms of economic growth of particular AI models, for example, as a way of guaranteeing internal security. The AI Continent Action Plan is an explicit industrial policy for AI built around what they call AI gigafactories. So again, linking the idea of factories, industrial policy, sort of the building of economic prosperity as a way of ensuring, as it says in the AI Continent Action Plan, we reduce those external vulnerabilities. And there was a very interesting report written about a year ago, I think it was now, talking about the fact that there was significant reliance on AI in Europe at this point. And if you look at all the models being used, they're all US-based models. And should any of them, one of them decide to disconnect or, reduce access, huge vulnerabilities created in the public sector in different European states. So again, this idea of weaponized independence in technology, reinforcing the desire for EU-based industrial policy. So I've got another article in the works on the digital omnibus because a lot of this simplification literature is discussing it being a form of deregulation. And I'm not sure I necessarily agree. I think there's an element of liberalization internally, again, for the purposes of competitiveness and security externally. Because what you see in a lot of these simplifications is it is not reducing those external barriers at all. And in some cases, they're actually reinforcing the external while trying to make things internally easier. In some respects, it's almost a return to sort of mercantilist market building. We reduce any barriers or sort of roadblocks to things happening internally to provide greater protection externally. And so I actually argue that the digital omnibus is not an example of deregulation, it's an example of regulatory mercantilism. So that's where I'm going to leave it. I'm slightly over, so I apologize. I'm happy for any questions anybody might have. For anybody that wants a physical copy of the book, I've provided a link to where you can find it, as well as the discount code. So if you use this discount code, you get 20% off any physical copies. But I'm more than happy to give extracts of chapters, for example, to anybody that may want them. So thank you very much for your time and attention, and happy for any questions anybody may have.